So I want to start by telling a story about my daughter when she was a junior in high school. So Lizzie was my third child and my last one to homeschool. She was very self-motivated, I guess is a good way to say it. And at the beginning, in the summer before her junior year, she came to me with her planner and said, Mom, we need to sit down and talk and get my school year planned. So Lizzie was my fine arts girl, and she was very involved in community theater, in classic ballet and tap. She was very involved in choir and piano, and it was a touring choir. And so that was performance. Those performances and those lessons were a large part of her school life. And it was one of the reasons we loved homeschooling, is because we could focus on each of the kids' individual interests and bents, like we talked about in the last session. So as we were going into her junior year, if any of you have had high school students, you know that sometimes your junior year is the watershed year. Your kids are preparing for the SAT or ACT. Their class load, Lizzie's class load, was a lot steeper her junior year than her senior year. And then she had, sometimes if she was in performances, she would have up to 30 hours a week in her performing arts endeavor. So as we sat down with her planner, I looked at her and I said, Liz, we need to reconsider some of this. I'm afraid this schedule is going to kill you. And so she said to me, Mom, I have prayed about this, and this is what I really believe the Lord wants me to do. So I'd like to start out trying this. Well, a few weeks later, we got a call from Bob Holmes, who was the news director at WMHK, which was our award-winning Christian radio station. He was a homeschool dad and would hire a homeschool student every year to be his news intern. So he called me and told me he wanted to interview Lizzie, and that it wasn't an interview where she would be getting coffee and filing papers, but he would learn to teach her how to use the software and hardware and do interviews all over the Midlands where we live in South Carolina. And he knew her interest in broadcast journalism and thought this would be a great opportunity for her. So now we're looking at an additional 10 hours to what we thought was already an impossible schedule. And Lizzie said, Mom, I really want to do this because I don't know if I'll have the opportunity next year. And sure enough, the program wasn't continued the next year. So she got into all of this. She had this unbelievable work ethic. And in the middle of the year, she just starts feeling terrible. It turns out she has mono. But she's in the middle of a performance with the community theater. She was in the middle of several things. And she said, Mom, I need to rest a little bit, but please let me continue these pursuits. And I promise when May comes, I'll sleep for 2 weeks. And, teenagers have that ability to sleep for 2 weeks. And so she soldiered through. And when the end of May came around, she had been selected to be one of our homeschool representatives to Girl State at a local college there in Columbia. And she was gone for a week. So I looked at my husband, Joe, and I said, Lizzie's been a real trooper this year. So we should redo her bedroom for her while she's gone. Now, for those of you who know anything about me, excuse me, it's the end of the week and I'm getting a raspy throat. You know that I am not a decorator. If I have anything decorated in my house, it's because a friend helped me. So for me to want to decorate Lizzie's room while she was gone was just, it had to have been divine inspiration. So every night when Joe would get home from work, we would go upstairs, we painted and cleaned out her closet and got her some new bedroom furniture. And we knew this would be a blessing for her, excuse me, to get her ready for her senior year and to do some things she just didn't have the time to do or the desire to do or the resources to do. So when the kids were growing up, I used to listen to my Bible every morning when Joe was in town. I'd walk for about an hour and I'd listen to the word. First, it was on my Walkman and on tape. And then that's why I love my iPhone so much. It's so easy to walk and listen to. And you know how you will hear a verse 1,000 times, and then it will take on new meaning. So I was listening to the Gospel of John the week that Lizzie was gone, and all of a sudden I'm hearing the reader say, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, I'm going to prepare a place for you." And Joe had kept asking me all week, why do you want to do this while Lizzie is gone? Why not do it with her? And I couldn't explain, because this was not my native gifting, why I was so excited about preparing her room for her. And it just dawned on me when I listened to this verse that you prepare a place for somebody because you love them. Jesus has prepared a place for us because he loves us and he wants us to be where he is. And I know, because he knows me so well, uniquely and individually, that the place he prepares for me will be different than the place he prepares for you. And as we were preparing Lizzie's room, her room was entirely different than the place we would have prepared, or the room we would have prepared for either one of our boys. But the point is that planning and preparation is really an act of love. And we plan and we prepare for people and for our children because we love them. God plans and prepares for us because he loves us. I love that verse from 1 Corinthians 2 where it says, we know that eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither has entered into the hearts of man those things that God has planned or prepared for those who love him. And so we know that God is a loving God and he has loving plans for us. And that in the same way, he wants us to be loving parents and have well thought through plans and goals for our children. It's pretty clear in Proverbs that there are two types of plans. Plans aren't just good because they're plans. There's a verse that says, don't those who plan evil go astray, but those who plan good find loyalty and faithfulness. So we know that there are those who plan evil and those who plan good. So there's nothing inherently good about planning. It's the motive behind it. So as parents, we are planning for good for our children. We're preparing a place for them here to educate them, to train them, to teach them, to love them, to cultivate their potential so that they can take their place in this world and also in eternity. So, and we know that God has prepared a place for them in heaven, just like he's prepared a place for us. So I just wanted to mention that we prepare and plan because we love our children. And we learn that from God. I mean, he's our model as a parent. He prepares and plans for us because he loves us. So having said that, I want to read you some verses from Proverbs and some other places. And so forgive me as I read, and don't feel like you have to take down all of the references. I can put those in the comments after we finish speaking. But I want you to notice what's said here about our plans. Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Proverbs 16:9. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Proverbs 16:1. The plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Now we get, so we are seeing a very definite picture in scripture here that it is not wrong to plan. It is good to plan, but we have to remember to hold on loosely to our plans, knowing that God can override them and replace them with his better plan at any point in time. Jeremiah 10:24 tells us, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not in man who walks to direct his own steps. Correct me, O Lord, but in judgment, not in your anger, lest you bring me to nothing. So Jeremiah here is recognizing that he has his own plans, but he knows that God's plan supersedes those. And he's asking, this is a good prayer for us. When God is about to change our plan, or when God needs to correct us, asking him to do it gently and out of love for us, not in his anger. And then there's another progression in scripture. One of my favorite verses, Psalm 37:23. A person's steps are directed by the Lord, and the Lord delights in his ways. I think we need to remember, as we place our plans in the hands of the Lord, that he delights in our way. I can remember when my mother was very ill and couldn't get out anymore. She's what we used to call a shut-in, because she was truly quarantined and shut in. She could not get out. She would love it when my grown children would go visit her. And she would love it when I would come visit her. She would want to hear every detail of my day. I was working for a publisher in Nashville then. Zan, how's your job? Are those people being nice to you? Are you fulfilled? How are the children doing? When do you travel next? And we talked all the time, so she really didn't need to ask me all those questions, but she wanted to hear all that from me. And why was that? Because she really delighted in my life and in my path. And there's nothing like it when your children come to you, especially when your grown children come to you and just want to visit and get your advice and tell you about their day. I mean, because you delight in your children, you want to hear those things. So in the same way, but in a much deeper and greater way, God delights in us. He wants to hear from us. He wants us to tell him about our days and our problems and our plans. And we need to remember that he is not a God who is austerely watching us from heaven, who is going to change our plans for no reason. But he is a loving Father who delights in our ways and only has our good in mind for us. All things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And then here's one of my favorite verses. I must have prayed this verse, 1,000 times over my kids and my own plans. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And so we need to remember to loosely hold our plans in our hands and submit them to the Lord, work on them before the Lord, pray over them with the Lord, and ask him to establish the work of our hands. It's amazing what he will do for us. Now, there are a couple of times, there are many reasons we need to keep our hearts open to change. One reason is sometimes God just wants us to change direction in some things we're doing. I can remember back in the early 2000s, I was an executive editor and acquisitions editor with Broadman and Holman Publishers in Nashville, Tennessee. So that meant I was over this division, and it was the Homeschool division we were just creating. And if you know anything about the publishing industry, it's sort of a mantra that publishers no longer accept unsolicited manuscripts. Well, mainly it's because publishers have a publishing plan. I knew the types of things I needed to publish each year, and I knew what I was looking for. So when I had an author who would submit a manuscript to me, sometimes it would be an excellent manuscript, but it didn't fit our publishing plan at that point in time. And so not in any way to be crude toward who God is, but I often thought about that when I thought about the Lord, because sometimes I'm a writer, so I'm writing out prayers and I'm writing out plans, and I would just have these great plans. And I would say, God, look at this great plan. This is a great plan. This is a great proposal I'm giving you. And it was like he would say, Zan, yeah, that's well written, but that's not the direction I have for you right now. This is what I have for you. And so we need to remember that God always has our best in mind. And sometimes he's just going to turn the rivers, the hearts of the kings, turn our hearts the way he wants us to go. Many are the plans in the mind of man, but we know the Lord directs our steps, and we need to be open to that. Sometimes God says no to us when we think we have a great plan for reasons that we can't see. So I'll give you one more illustration from my life. We were we had not started homeschooling yet. We were actually had moved back from Boston, Massachusetts, and we were looking for a house in the school district that I had been raised in because they were excellent public schools. That's where my kids were going, to public schools. And so good friends of ours had a house they were getting ready to sell. It was our price range. It was the perfect neighborhood. It was close to my parents. It's the right size. I mean, it was perfect. So I called my friend and I said, we'd really like to buy your house. It hadn't been listed yet. And she said, well, Zan, I'm just not going to sell you my house. And then she said, I think we're going to rent it to our youth pastor. And I was so frustrated and my feelings were hurt. I kept telling the Lord, that is the perfect house for us. I know that's where you want us to be. Well, the Lord said no. My friend said no. We were not going to buy that house. And a couple of years later, when we started homeschooling, I rode by that house and I realized that house is right across the street from the District 2 public school office. And the district office, the superintendent is there. I could not have driven out of my driveway without everybody in the district office seeing me. My kids couldn't have played in the front yard. I could have never left the house. I mean, those were the days where I was threatened with jail and I was under scrutiny anyway. And there are so many times I told the Lord, thank you for telling me no. Thank you, thank you, thank you for telling me no and having a better plan for me. And so sometimes we just need to realize when God tells us no, we might not understand it at the time, but He has something much better for us, much better in mind. So all of this just has to do with putting our plans before the Lord and being open to His changing them. I came across, I went to hear a speaker with my daughter, Ray Vanderlaan. And you may have heard me tell you this before, but to me, this is worth repeating over and over again. He has his PhD, I believe it's in Hebrew studies. I need to go back and look that up, but he is really a Hebrew scholar. He spent a lot of time in the Holy Land. And when Focus on the Family produced their videos on the Holy Land years ago, he did them. And he would take tours to the Holy Land and read scripture and then apply it to our daily lives. It was really powerful. He was a Christian educator. He taught in a Christian school and he loved education. He loved books. He loved curriculum. But in this session, I heard him say, the books we choose are our curriculum, but the interruptions and the things that God brings into our lives, the disruptions, the joys, that's God's curriculum for us. And this was coming from a man who didn't eschew the value of education. He valued a good education, but he realized God's position as the ultimate superintendent of education, bringing the right curriculum into our lives to teach us what we would never learn any other way. And I know you can think of times in your life when you had your school year planned and you had a major disruption. And you're thinking, what do I do now, Lord? Is this from you? Is this my fault? I've talked to several of the consultants, and we know that there are many of you, just like we have been, in a place where you're on the point of crisis or catastrophe. And we can't question that the Lord's hand is not still with us. Okay, that had way too many negatives in it. Regardless of what we're facing, the Lord is with us. And He is bringing us circumstances through which He wants to teach us. So I can think of two situations in my own life, in Joe's and our marriage, our life, our family life, One was when we were facing our first public hearing in South Carolina. So this would have been 1986. We started homeschooling in 1984. Took us a while. We were fighting bad legislation. We're getting a grassroots movement going. And so we had the opportunity for our first public hearing. Well, the boys were 5 and 7 at the time, and I was about 5 or 6 months pregnant and started experiencing some real pain. So I called my obstetrician, my OB, who was a good friend of ours, and he said, this is the day now. This is the day where they're not ultrasounds in every doctor's office. So I had to go down to the University of South Carolina, their high-risk pregnancy program, and have an ultrasound done. Well, it turned out that Joy, our daughter, had 7 life-incompatible anomalies. And so I gave birth to Joy about probably 2 or 3 weeks later, when I was about 6 months pregnant, and almost died during the process. So she was stillborn, and it was just a crisis for us. The boys had been very involved. They were so excited about having a little sister. They had been to all my appointments with me. You know how it is when you're a homeschool family, you're all invested in each other's lives. Well, while we were in the hospital recovering from the birth and death of Joy, and also from just the physical issues I had been through with that birth, we got the call from the State Department of Education, leaving us a message on our answering machine that said we had 60 days to plan for the public hearing, the first homeschool public hearing in South Carolina. And later, as I was cleaning out some old archives, I've got so many legal archives in our home from homeschooling lawsuits and days and legislation, I found this yellow legal pad that had handwriting on it, but it was just all tear stained. And those were the notes we had taken to plan that first public hearing from our hospital room, where we were still really mourning Joy's death. And so, I kept thinking during that time period, Lord, I just want to go home. I don't want to homeschool anymore. I want to go home and cry and grieve. I don't want to teach my children right now. I don't want to be in the legislature. I can tell you that much. I just want to be left alone. But that was not God's plan. God's plan was to teach my children a lot about eternity, that this life is not all there is, and that Joy had the perfect parent, the perfect father who would always raise her, and that she would be waiting for us one day when our lives are over here. And so those were lessons of eternity that God chose to teach my children at a time that really didn't suit me. And so I think sometimes we just have to realize, like Ray Vanderline said, that the curriculum we choose for our children, and we try to choose well, it's our curriculum, but the interruptions and the distresses God brings into our lives, are His curriculum. Another thing that I learned on the way to jail, I have a workshop at 10 lessons I learned on the way to jail. But as we were lobbying, things were different then. I mean, there was a lot of hostility toward homeschooling, and there was no internet and there was no email. So there would be a lot of times I'd have to get the boys dressed. I'd get dressed. We just have to go sit and wait at the State House to find out about when a meeting would be scheduled, or see if I could just run into a legislator or a senator. So we were always, the first 8 years we homeschooled, we were either in court or in the legislature doing some type of campaign. And it was like the boys were raised at the State House. It was their home away from home. And I can remember Joe had built me this little curriculum closet. Actually, it's not a big curriculum. It's not a little, it's a huge curriculum closet where I kept hundreds and hundreds of books. And I can just remember weeping in that closet by myself over workbook pages that weren't getting done while we were in the legislature. And then, it's interesting because I see how God's curriculum superseded mine at times during those years, because my second son has a heart for public policy. He's an attorney. He's very involved in public policy issues. My oldest son, he just has a heart for people that he learned while he was in the legislature with me, dealing with hostile senators and sometimes hostile legislators and helping me with homeschool moms. It was really a training ground from them that I could never see at the time. So sometimes some of the hardest things in our lives are things that God has brought us to teach us things that we would never learn otherwise. Sometimes God changes our plans for other people's needs. Last year, I did this Worldview Fellowship program from the Colson Fellows, and one of their books I read was a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by Nabil Qureshi. And he was a committed Muslim who became a Christian. He was in medical school at the time, and there's a scene in the book where he is down on his knees just crying before the Lord because he knows he's going to lose his family, and he's very close to his family in his Muslim community when he commits his life to Christ. And he says, God, why does this have to be so hard? And he said the answer the Lord immediately gave him is, because, Nabil, it's not about you. And so sometimes God gives us hard tasks to do because it's not about us, it's about others. And we see all through Scripture where Jesus had plans that were constantly interrupted by the needs for other people. I mean, I was just reading in Mark the other day. I mean, there's so many instances when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he stayed and began teaching them many things. He was going somewhere else that day, and his plans were changed by the needs of others. And we see that throughout the Gospels. Jesus always changing his plans because of the needs of others. I mean, really, he changed his ultimate plan of staying in heaven in constant fellowship with the Father to come take a body of flesh as a poor human being born in a manger and living a poor life and dying on a cross for us. So that was the ultimate interruption and divine intervention. And he changed his plans. He gave up his life for us. So sometimes God changes our plans, changes our curriculum, with the large C versus the little c, because he's got other things planned for us. But there are two things we always know that will stay the same in God's scope and sequence chart for us. As home educators or as just official educators, scope and sequence charts are a big thing. I had to learn what those were when I first began homeschooling. But there are two things in God's scope and sequence chart that will never change. First, his goal for us is that we love him with all of our heart and soul and mind. That's the greatest commandment. That's the first thing in his scope and sequence chart. And it's true, not just for us, but for our children. And the second thing is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so we see God disrupting our great plans, our great proposals we have, because he wants us to love him more, and he wants us to take care of other people in ways that we can't foresee at the time. It's so interesting in God's providence. I have to read this to you. A dear friend of mine, Jan Smith, who is in homeschool leadership, and she's just one of my dearest friends, just out of the blue texted me this morning. And I feel so compelled to read this to you because she had no idea what I was speaking on today. She said, at one point, her husband, who is a doctor, she said there was no denying God's miraculous allowance of Roger to get that hugely competitive residency slot. And then it was so hard on us as a family. I was confused as to why God would do that to us. But our faith grew tremendously during that time. And her point is that God leads us into difficult situations. A lot of times, when I first started homeschooling and I was threatened with jail, I kept telling the Lord, Lord, I am so confused because I thought I was following you. And then the lesson that Jan says here is so true. She says, we have to tell others that sometimes God leads us straight into a situation where there is a difficulty of some sort, just to get us to cry out to Him rather than grumble and complain. He wants us to see His direct involvement in providing needing wisdom and direct provision of our need. And so sometimes we think, what did we do wrong? What happened to us that our plan changed so drastically for this school year? Or Lord, why did you bring this disaster or crisis into our lives? And I think that's the reason why. The second thing I want to read you here, Jan is a master gardener. And I don't say that lightly. She and her husband were head of the Louisiana Garden Club. And she said one of the things she's doing right now, I'm overseeing a town overhaul of 3 flower beds that has tremendously overgrown, died, and been infested by vines and trees growing in the middle. Pruning is an essential part of plant health. And sometimes God just wants to prune us. And sometimes, I am not a gardener, but I do know this. We have to prune the bushes in the front of our house. And sometimes they are so ugly after we finish pruning. I wonder if they're ever going to bear fruit or leaves or anything else again. And then they come back fuller and lusher than ever before. And I know you feel this way. I certainly feel this way, that there have been times that God has cut so deeply into my heart or my life that I wonder, am I going to survive this, Lord? What are you doing to me? But is the master gardener pruning us, not because He doesn't care about us, but because He wants us to bear even more fruit for Him. So I just want to encourage you that we as homeschoolers, as homeschooling parents, we plan diligently and respectfully for our children out of love. God has called us to teach them at home. We need to plan. But we need to remember that, thank goodness, we have a God who is in control. And sometimes He takes our plans and He establishes them and He shows us favor, just like Psalm 90 says. And other times He takes them and changes them and then establishes them and shows us favor. So we just need to learn and remember that He is the master gardener. It's time for us to close. But I want to share one more story from Scripture with you that has so much meaning for me. This just was one of these verses that I was read to lead when I was in the midst of a failing lobbying campaign, and it's about Shammah, who is one of David's mighty men. This is a passage from 2 Samuel 23, 11, and 12. And it says, next to him was Shammah, son of Agi, the Hararite. How's that for mispronouncing with a southern accent? When the Philistines banded together at a place where there was a field full of lentils, Israel's troops fled from them. Now, if I had an army coming after me and I was just defending a lentil field, I think I'd run too. But Shammah took his stand in the middle of the field. He defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. So in this particular legislative campaign, a pastor was working closely with me. And I remember looking at him and saying, I feel like God has given us our homeschools, and they're these little lentil patches that nobody else in the world may care about. But it's our family, our home, our children, not just their well-being here on earth, but their eternal destinations, their spiritual lives, and their souls that we're fighting for. And I said, is it wrong to liken what we're doing to defending that lentil patch? And he said, no, Zan, I think you were right on. So I want you to notice what happens when he stayed there against all odds in the middle of disaster and crisis. Everybody else has fled, and this is just the lentil patch. And this is what happened. It says he took his stand in the middle of the field. He defended it and struck the Philistines down. And the Lord brought about great victory, so great that it's recorded in Scripture. So I want to encourage you, your home, the lentil patch God has put you in, it is worth standing for and fighting for, regardless of the hard times that come your way. Paul says there are going to be many tribulations on our road to the kingdom. He said that in Acts. But we need to stand firm, knowing that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. We need to remember that, and we need to remember that even in something that seems small and insignificant to the rest of the world, our homes, they are incredibly important to God. And when we stand for our children and our homes, God says he will give us a great victory. So we need to keep our eyes on the prize, and we need to hold our plans before the Lord and ask him to bless them and prosper us and establish them.